I want to try to casually explain to this community of victims how our governments are doing this to us and how they're doing this to you. I'm going to try to do this casually, so just bear with me. But I've created all of this just to explain it to people so they can actually see what's going on. What they're doing is they're interfacing with the living brain using nanoparticles inside the brain. And what this is a piece of microtubule. And this, shown in complete and total exaggeration, would be inside your neuron. They're like little hairs inside your neuron. And what these nanoparticles do is they can bind to the tubulin that makes up the microtubule. Kind of like, hair follicles or the scales on a hair making up the hair. Way more complex though. And what they do is they bind to the actual lone pairs in the tubulin, because the nitrogen vacancy is itself part of a lone pair. So that's basically how they can bind to the tubulin. And these nanoparticles can be put into our food purposely and tailored to bypass the blood-brain barrier. So they'll end up inside your brain. Thousands of them inside your brain, inside the neurons inside your brain. But at this point, they're just sitting there. They're not connected to any network. What they need to do is get these things into you and then brain map you and scan you. And what they do is they basically pulse you with lasers so that they can entangle the brain, the nitrogen vacancy that's inside the brain, with the scanner that would be underneath you. Because there's a nitrogen vacancy at this point attached to the tubulin. So what they're going to do is they're going to look through the brain and try to focus on that nitrogen vacancy. And what they're going to do is they're going to entangle that vacancy to another vacancy in the detector using the same source. And that's why they pulse you with the lasers, because they're pulsing you with the same photon source, so that one photon hits the nitrogen vacancy and the other one hits the scanner below you. And what they basically get is a shadow of the object. So they basically get a shadow of the nitrogen vacancy. But because we're talking about quantum mechanics and wave functions and quantum states, what they get more so is a shadow of the wave function belonging to that quantum state. And what they do is they teleport the value of the nitrogen vacancy directly into their quantum network. So they get these things into your body, into your bloodstream. And I'm talking the whole population here. Like, we really have to watch out, because this isn't just me. I'm not the only victim here. They are doing this to thousands of people, so I have to let this information out. I've held on to this for far too long. And if I die, this information goes with me. So I want people to actually understand what they've done to us. And these nanoparticles will end up inside your brain. And what they can do is they can entangle the nanoparticle and the nitrogen vacancy that it possesses, because it possesses multiple ones. It's just they want to find the one that's actually binded to the tubulin, because what happens at that level is it basically entangles the vacancy, entangles to the electron that belongs to the tubulin. They become a pair. They're no longer a lone pair. They're a bonded pair. And what you want is the quantum state of the vacancy that is now bonded to the electron in the tubulin. And what we want to do is measure the quantum state of that nitrogen vacancy when the brain is at rest. So the neuron that it's inside of will be at rest. And because everything is at rest, that nitrogen vacancy is allowed to be at its predetermined ground state, because all these nitrogen vacancies have basically been created in their own predetermined ground states. So DARPA and the governments have a catalog of all the known quantum states belonging to all these nitrogen vacancies, but they don't know which nanoparticle it is, who got that nanoparticle, or where it ended up in your brain. But they do have a record of all these quantum states that they have fed to their neural network. So now when these nanoparticles end up in someone's brain, they have a better chance of recognizing the wave function that belongs to the nitrogen vacancy. And it basically becomes a quantum mechanical IP address, because they entangle that vacancy to the scanner below you. And the scanner below you was previously entangled to Alice, or to Bob. So Bob ends up with the state of the nitrogen vacancy inside your brain. And what they do is they can now connect us all to a quantum neural network. Because what they do is they teleport that value onto an awaiting nitrogen vacancy that is part of a neural network. And this is where the second part comes in, because where they teleport it to is a Memristor. They teleport it into a Memristor neural network. Because Memristors also use nitrogen vacancies. All you have to do is start researching this. Memristors and neural networking. The whole world can research this if they want. Especially nitride memristors. Because a nitride memristor would use nitrogen vacancies. Because if you notice, here's nitride memristors. They use nitrogen vacancies, okay? The switching of the device, the way it switches back to its resting state, just like a neuron, it's dictated by the vacancies. And our neurons switch back to the resting state after firing, and that is dictated by the ion flow. So what they can do is they can screw with our brains and get our neurons to process information and exchange ions by manipulating their Memristor network. And they can interface with our brains because the Memristors also use vacancies to compute with. It's new technology. It's the newest kind of microchip. And what they use are vacancies. All these little dots they're vacancies. And that's how the Memristor remembers, because all of these contain spin states that help the device remember its memory and the past state that ran through it, just like our neurons remember their past state. So what they're doing is they're basically making these vacancies, which dictate the entire chip, basically. They dictate the firing of the chip. The switching of the chip is caused by the movement of vacancies. And because they can entangle vacancies together, what they're doing basically is entangling the vacancies inside the brain on the nanoparticles to the vacancies that are basically making up the chip. Not these ones directly, but more so the input neuron. Because if you look at the crossbars, those vacancies exist in between all the crossbars. And they act like a synapse. See? They act like a synapse. The same way the synapse exchanges ions. That's why this is a marvel. They're simulating the brain. And these memristors exchange vacancies basically the same way that the neuron exchanges ions. And the entire charge or the resting potential for this crossbar is dictated by the output neuron. There's post neurons and pre-neurons, or other words, input and output. So what these chips actually illustrate is the way the brain and the neurons are connected together. So when they scan the brain, they can actually map out how your neurons are connected to each other and then rebuild that connection and that connectomy using the vacancies that they can see through your brain and attach to the neurons. And then they can chart it out and map it all out into this neural network so that your neurons are being simulated by a memristor because they've entangled the vacancies that exist, that will also exist at the ancilla bit. These would be the ancillary bit of the memristor. If you could actually look into the details of these really advanced memristors, you will find out that these are basically ancillary bits. Because look at this, okay? This is an ancilla bit. And you see how this ancilla, this garbage? These are qubits, basically. And they store values. And they're used in quantum error correction. So what they're doing with the memristors now is they're creating the same kind of ancilla bit. That's what these are. The output neurons and the input neurons are basically the memristors ancilla bit. So what they can do now is each ancilla bit can be described or can be controlled using a qubit. So there's nitrogen vacancies in the ancilla bits, in the input and output neurons. And that is where they are entangling the one inside the brain to. So now the one inside the brain that basically represents this neuron can be represented in the memristor network by this neuron. And the way the one inside your brain connects with another neuron and its nitrogen vacancies will be represented by this neuron. So they can recreate the way your brain and your neurons connect to each other, and they can entangle each one of those representations to the living brain and the neuron itself through the use of the vacancies. Because what they can do is teleport the value of this nitrogen vacancy directly into their quantum neural network and etch it, literally recreate it and etch it, burn it, using nanolithography and electron irradiation processes, and actually etch it directly into the memristor. So they teleport the quantum state of the nitrogen vacancy inside your brain that's attached to the neuron directly to the memristor network. So now you are entangled with the network. And they do it all basically using their imaging system so they can look through the brain. And what they're looking through the brain with are nitrogen vacancies. Even their scanners and their detectors are using nitrogen vacancies for the imaging of living cells. But in our case, they're not imaging the living cell, they're imaging nanodiamonds and nanoparticles inside the living cell. Just like this. New diamond and global-based techniques let scientists measure and control the temperature inside living cells. And what they're doing here is they're putting nitrogen vacancies inside living cells, like cancer cells. And what they can do is they can heat up the nitrogen vacancy and destroy the cancer cell. But when it comes to brains, what they can do is instead of truly heating it up to destroy the cell, which is how they can leave us vegetables, they can destroy our cells from the inside because they've entangled to the nitrogen vacancy inside the cell instead of just blasting it with light. What they do is they entangle to them and they make the nitrogen vacancy inside the living cell part of their Memristor network. So now they can screw with our brain over this quantum network. And that's why all of these experiments have been going on with quantum networking and China. Watch.
Quantum entangle experiment performed on this satellite showed that shared quantum states can extend over 1,200 kilometers, smashing the previous world record. Quantum entanglement is physics at its strangest. Subatomic particles like photons can be entangled by sharing their quantum states, such as their spin and polarization. Even if the photons are separated by vast distances, these shared states should remain in limbo until one of the objects is measured or disturbed. Then the quantum states for both photons suddenly collapse to a set value, with no information passing between the two. With fiber optics, scientists have been able to demonstrate quantum entanglement on Earth across a few hundred kilometers. Any farther out, and the photon's quantum states are upset by fluctuations in the atmosphere. But photons travel much more smoothly in the near vacuum of space. That's where the MICEUS, the first space-based quantum research platform, comes in.
And this is why
inside MICEUS, an ultraviolet laser is...
This is why the attacks happened, or this is how the attacks happened in China and Cuba. Because China was using this device to attempt to brain map US diplomats while overseas.
Split and sent into a special crystal that produces entangled photons with opposite polarization states. The pairs are then beamed down to Earth, 5.9 million entangled pairs per second. Two ground stations in China, over 1,200 kilometers apart, receive the photons. When the scientists measured the states of the incoming photons, they were correlated far more often than would be expected by random chance. Evidence that the photons had remained entangled across large distances. Although the transmission of the entangled photons was much more efficient than ground-based experiments, still just 1 in 6 million photons made it to the base stations. Next, the researchers plan to distribute quantum keys to the stations, which requires long strings of entangled photons. With entangled encryption keys, two people in separate locations could communicate secretly with each other, and any attempt at eavesdropping would be noticed. Researchers plan to extend the reach of the fledgling quantum network by adding more satellites and ground stations. That would be a stepping stone to a space-based, worldwide, quantum internet.
Which is why you can't get away from it, because they've already done this. And you can see all that when you look at the CubeSat program. And you start looking at how many CubeSats are in space right now. And how many of them are actually created using nitrogen vacancies. All of this can be done. You can do all this research yourself. CubeSat program nitrogen vacancies in diamond. There's a reason they're putting nitrogen vacancies into satellites, because they've created a global quantum network. And all of these CubeSats are basically going to be quantum repeaters for their network. And what they can do is now they can entangle our brains directly into this global quantum network, because our brains now have nitrogen vacancies in them. And these memristors can reset back to the value we teleport to them in the picosecond. But entanglement between nitrogen vacancies can last merely 14 nanoseconds. So entanglement lives and dies quickly between nitrogen vacancies. But the memristors can reset back to that value 1,000 times faster than decoherence occurs. So it's basically like entanglement never dies between the nitrogen vacancy attached to the tubulin in your neuron versus the nitrogen vacancies in the memristors, because they're resetting back to that value faster than entanglement can decohere. And the switching of these devices, look at this. Nitride memristor. Oops. The switching, okay? Pinch, the switching is vacancies. Watch this. Sorry, vacancies. They are responsible for the switching of the device. See, there it is. The motion of positively charged nitrogen vacancies is likely responsible for the observed switching. So what that basically means is that it switches back to the ground state. And you can find more information on that out there. But that's exactly what's happening, because these memristors are resistive switchers, which means they remember their past state. That's why they're memristors. And they remember the past state because of the vacancies. And we can entangle to those vacancies. So all you have to do is do the math, and you can see the biggest crimes ever committed in all of history. And the only people that could be doing this to us are the governments who control the satellite systems and the technology itself. Which is why, in the end times, the 10 horns will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them.